All right, here we go. Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to let folks file in here for a couple more seconds here, get settled in. We have a very exciting hour planned with everyone this afternoon, talking about the latest theme journal. All right, I think everyone who is asked to be let in our meeting is in. So we will get things started. All right. My name is Camille Perlman. I am the managing editor of the Talking Stick for the association. Not only is that an honor, that publication is an honor to work with, but so is the journal. So I have the honor of working with our journal board year round and working with all of the associate editors and the reviewers who do this huge task of taking in the journal manuscripts for us, working with their teams to make sure those manuscripts get reviewed and hopefully get into the publishing process with us here at the association. The association publishes 2 regular issue journals every year along with a theme issue journal. And the theme issue is what brings us here today. This came out in April. The topic is the sense of belonging and the residential experience. And we had a wonderful time working with our guest editors. Some of you probably already know these wonderful people, but let me introduce you to them again today. We have Deborah Taub from Binghamton, Paola Mignon from Binghamton University as well, and we also have Brian Gano from UNC Wilmington and Gano Consulting. I have been working with these 3 wonderful people throughout the past year on this theme issue. And we are excited to present it to you here today. We also have guest authors with us today. We have 3 of the authors from one of the manuscripts, and we also have an additional author from an additional manuscript. Let me introduce you to them. We have Dr. Tony Coffin from Clemson University. We have Dina Neese from Appalachian State University. We have Brad Johnson from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And we have Morgan Murray Lewis from Georgia State University. All right, and of course we have to take care of a little housekeeping here. Today's session, just so everyone's aware, it is being recorded. We would love for you to use the chat to introduce yourself and most certainly ask us questions today. This is a conversation-based meeting. So these guest editors, these guest authors, they would love to hear your questions about this research that is in this theme issue. We encourage you to keep your webcam on. It makes it more conversational. If not, we respect that. And as I mentioned, we will be using the chat function for handling all of your questions today. Brian is nice enough. He is going to be monitoring our questions in the chat. He will monitor the questions during the guest author presentations today. So please, we are allowing 3 minutes for each of their presentations for questions. And so we are really hoping you all will have great questions for our guest authors today. And Brian will be keeping track of those today. And I believe, let's see, my last slide. Whoop, we are going to quickly look at the agenda. So you just know the lay of the land for the next hour that you're going to be spending with us. So we've done introductions, the overview of the issue, author presentations. Oh, yes, sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to have the author presentations, the overview of the remaining articles, reflections from our guest editors, and then a little time, probably about 5 minutes at the end for questions and answers. Whoop, was that me? I guess that was me. So without further ado, I will hand the mic to Brian. Brian, take it away.
Yes, welcome everybody. So excited to start talking about this topic. It's a topic I truly enjoy researching and studying and working on. So, what we want to do is just lay the foundation quickly about some things about belonging so that everyone's a little bit on the same page. And this also reflects some of the things that we wrote in our editor letter about sense of belonging. And when we think about sense of belonging, we can take a look at it from different perspectives. And typically, you can look at it from uh, a psychological point of view, a sociological point of view, and even a spiritual point of view, if you like. A lot of times, and I think with among the editors, we focus mostly on the psychological point of view for belonging, and really talking about that sort of hierarchy of needs that Maslow talked about, and set that step above safety. And that's really important, particularly among a lot of different populations for students, is that safety has to be truly present before belonging really does start to exist. But one of the key features about belonging from the psychological sense of view is that it's about deep personal, interpersonal relationships that are consistent and constant. And that is where a lot of belonging starts to form, is through those relationships. Uh, and when we think about it in those terms, we also start looking into what it means in the research for us to say that you have keys to successful transition. And a lot of that is tied also to those types of relationships and that social capital you may have and be able to pull on and work with individuals. And then to that third point where it's about the student and their environment, that you have to have certain conditions really to be set up. And if we frame it back into that Maslow's hierarchy, really it can go back to that sense of safety, really looking at things that you are able to start to focus on your personal needs about belonging and where you're going to be fitting in. And a lot of times those environmental factors, when we talk about from a belonging standpoint, have to do with validation, understanding who we are, feeling like that people care about you and that you're recognized in those spaces. So those are the first key points. I'm going to let Deb really finish out this slide.
So another concept that's important, I think, to understand as we're talking about sense of belonging is a closely related concept called mattering. Nancy Schlossberg brought the idea of mattering and its opposite, marginality, um, into the student affairs and higher ed literature. And mattering is the feeling that other people depend on us, that they're interested in us, that they're concerned with what happens to us. And they'll be happy for us about our accomplishments, and they'll be sad for us about our misfortunes, and that other people appreciate us. The opposite of all of that, if you don't feel those things, if you don't feel like you matter, it's marginality. Students are at great risk for feeling marginal as they make transitions, particularly say into a new college setting. When they particularly when they don't yet know the ropes, they don't yet feel like they belong. um, this idea of mattering comes in, and marginality comes into play. There's an idea that people have thought that belonging has aspects of both mattering and a sense of community. And some of our authors are going to be talking about that idea of belonging and community as we go along. The other thing to know is that belonging has been related to a lot of desired outcomes for students, such as grade point average and this feeling of academic self efficacy, like they can do it. as well as their intention to persist. There have also been links between belonging and mental and physical health.
Thank you, Deb and Brian, for that introduction to sense of belonging. One of the things we added in our editor letter is why are we looking at belonging now? Why now, more than ever, are we interested in belonging? One, Brian talked about Maslow hierarchy of needs and the student's sense of safety was challenged, and then we had the psychological component as well, on top of the multiple transitions they were engaging in, not only transition to college, but transition in terms of the processes and practices that happened around them. So we felt important that we look at sense of belonging now more than ever during the pandemic. We all know this, pandemic restrictions disrupted the ways in which colleges and universities conducted business. It disrupted how students took classes, how they engaged with one another, how they engaged with faculty and staff, and all of those disruptions were led or caused or engendered by institutional practices, policies, all in the name of health and safety. Similarly, students had to make decisions based on their own comfort level, uh, personal comfort level with the virus. So all of that had to be negotiated with students. All of those changes translated into an environment in which what the norm now was online methods of instructions, online interaction, limited in-person gatherings, social distancing. And we know that for many students, living on campus is an important part of the college experience, is a formative part. And most of the times it's a positive part of their college experience. We believe that residential life departments and professionals have an important role in creating sense of belonging and helping students make connections. And the articles that we have here today being presented to you provides a number of perspectives in the role of residential life departments and how they can help develop and support students in their sense of belonging. With that, I will kick it to the first presentation, Cawthon et al.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to kick us off. I'm Tony Cawthon. I'm a faculty member at Clemson University, and I'm going to kick it off before my colleagues, Dr. Dina Neese and Dr. Brad Johnson, give a little more detail. Just to remind you specifically what our study was doing, it was examining the role of belonging in university housing among perspectives of chief university housing officers and senior housing officers. We really wanted to know how they were defining community and what strategies they were using to build supportive and inclusive communities, with a great attention paid to how had those strategies and that definition of belonging been altered or impacted by COVID-19? Very much to what Paolo just said, that it had a tremendous impact on how we did that. So we had a great job of investigating and talking with student housing officers to about that concept with that. So I'm going to let Dina share a little bit about the information about the themes that emerged, which some were surprising to us and some were not. So I'll kick it over to her to do that part.
Yes, thank you, Tony. We went ahead and we interviewed 10 senior housing officers and we engaged in purposeful sampling. So we went through all the regions in Akuhoi and picked and had housing directors from each region. There are four main themes that we constructed. The first one is when we asked the senior housing officers how they define belonging, they indicated that belonging is an outcome of community building. So if you're building community, one of the results is a sense of belonging. The other thing we asked in terms of that we found through the study is that the use of the physical space in the residence halls and on campus and live on policies matter. There was one particular interviewee who said we don't have a live on requirement, but they still had a high percentage of individuals choosing to have either first year students or second year students live on campus. One quote that emerged from one of our participants was this idea of alone but together, that specifically after the pandemic, it was hard to get people to want to re-engage in physically big events. So there were some things where events needed to be smaller, or if we needed to be doing some things alone but together, for example, like a silent disco. But thinking about how do we create those opportunities, knowing that when students came back from the pandemic, it's that whole idea of being together again when you were told, hey, you need to social or physical distance, that trying to get them to re-engage and thinking about is it safe to re-engage socially was difficult. The last one was there seemed to be an increased focus on mental health and well-being, not only among student populations, but among staff. There are some specific universities that went in and had mental health counselors or even social workers assigned to specific buildings on campus. There's also a few who readjusted their staffing patterns in terms of having either resident directors answer on call or having that go to some other emergent response or breaking up the role of the RA to have those focus just on community building, those focus just on safety and security. But noting that mental health and well-being has been an increasing area where they've paid a lot of attention to since the pandemic. And now I'll turn it over to Brad Johnson to give some takeaways.
Thanks, Dina. So, as we are talking about belonging, we discovered that belonging varies greatly in terms of its definition. We had a lot of participants that also used the word community interchangeably with belonging, especially with the state of our nation and higher ed today with DEI concerns. So, housing professionals have got to get on the same page in terms of how they are defining belonging in relation to their initiatives so that they know how to assess that and how belonging, what it will look like when it is achieved through the initiatives that they are doing. We also found that there was a move away from the residential curricula and learning models or learning communities, which we found interesting because that was kind of contrary to what the latest campus housing index told us in terms of people were utilizing more residential curricula and learning models to achieve this sense of community. Um, we we just Dina talked about the alone but together opportunities, and we also found that the question came up about who's responsible for establishing community or sense of belonging. And it should be a campus initiative and not necessarily something solely relegated to housing. It's kind of like retention. A lot of times we will hear our presidents or chancellors say that retention is everybody's job. It's not just enrollment services or enrollment management. In terms of some of the staffing practices that Dina spoke about, the nature of work and living in the residence hall, whether that's as a staff or a student, has changed and is still continuing to change. We see our students are coming in with more concerns about their basic needs. Brian talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and what we're finding is that the RA position is getting harder to build and sustain that sense of community because their time is being redirected towards working with students, mental health concerns, safety concerns, and well-being. So what we're seeing is that some of those traditional RA and live-in staff roles are going back to the basics, so to speak, and focusing more on building individual relationships and promoting well-being instead of doing some of the more elaborate or complex job functions that we may have seen such positions do in the past. And then the last part was the campus space and everything. So we discovered that campus partnerships and design spaces are key to creating community. So an environmental audit may need to be implemented on your campuses to see what spaces work best for what kind of initiatives. And then also working with campus partners. So it goes back to kind of that alone but together mentality. Utilize the partnerships that you have and the resources you have with the campus partners as housing professionals, knowing that you don't have to always do everything alone or within your housing and residence life silo.
Excellent. Thank you, Brad. Perfect timing because we're coming up on the limit here, and I've got a couple minutes here for some questions that are coming into the chat. The first one looks like from Simon Finn, wondering if you've seen a similar shift in what hall directors are also focused on, i.e., community building versus case management, individual support. I'll let any of the authors go ahead and tackle that one. And the question's in the chat if you want to reread it before you answer.
I don't know that we had a lot of people talk about the community director role. Most of them focused on the RA role. Dean and Brad, do you remember? I think most people didn't really go there. They really went with the sort of the boots on the ground, the person on the residence hall floor, attempting to create community on the floor of the building. They didn't talk about the community directors or assistant directors or even their own role.
Mhm.
But I
No,
think it's safe to go ahead, Dina.
no, I was going to say, I don't think, I would agree with you, Tony. I think a lot focused on the RA role. I think, I think in some of these newer staffing models, they started looking at hiring specific individuals, whether it was counselors for residence halls or social workers, to look at the case management aspect. There are only a few universities that did that, but not a lot talked about the community director role.
But I think it's safe to say that those roles are probably going to be affected as well, given that they are working with
Yes.
and supervising the frontline RA or student staff members. So I would imagine that even though we did not directly hear that from our
Yeah.
participants, that it's safe to say that they are being affected in some form or fashion.
Yes, it's like if it changes from the bottom, it's going to work its way up, you
Yes.
know. And we started with the probably the mass, which is your RA
Mhm.
staff for most places. So I think Brad's insight is spot on.
Excellent. It looks like that's a question, and that's great for timing here. So we'll move to our next author, which I believe, yep, is Morgan Murray is joining us today. So I will hand it over.
Hi, everyone. I was able to co-author a study called about isolation and belonging, the complex reality of Black resident assistants. As many of you know, I'm familiar with the RA position and how demanding it can be, and some of the roles they play in helping build community, connect students to resources, and support their students. But this study really focused on what happens when the students who are helping create belonging for others struggle to find it themselves. And so that's what we explored in the study, looking specifically at the lived experiences of Black resident assistants or RAs at historically white institutions or HWIs. So these students often face the dual reality of fostering inclusion while navigating environments where they may feel isolated, misunderstood, and underrepresented. So the purpose of the study was to understand how Black RAs experience their role and their own sense of belonging. The study was grounded in Strayhorn's sense of belonging model, which defines belonging as feeling connected, valued, and cared for, as we kind of talked about some in the introduction to this session. But Strayhorn reminds us that belonging isn't just about fitting in, it's also about being seen and being able to show up authentically, especially in places that weren't built with you in mind. For the methodology for the study, it was a qualitative phenomenological study. We interviewed 10 Black RAs from six various historically white institutions. We used a method called photo voice, where participants take photos that represent their experience and then have discussion about those photos and how they find meaning in them. And so photo voice is a powerful tool, particularly for marginalized students to be able to tell their stories visually and emotionally. So one of the key findings of the study that was the most consistent in talking to the participants was related to isolation. The RAs that we studied, even when they had good relationships with their peers or with their supervisors, they often felt misunderstood or like they didn't fully belong. Several of the RAs described physical divides in staff meetings or social events. Some of the pictures from the study kind of capture that, where staff naturally felt that there was segregation by race and that no one seemed to notice or address it. Others spoke about cultural disconnects and feeling exhausted by being often the only one or one of few Black identities on their staff, and some cultural divides in terms of not understanding their jokes or their music, or being left out of some unspoken social norms. to manage kind of those feelings of isolation, the RAs in the study talked about developing counter spaces. So several of them referred to their campus multicultural center, various Black student organizations, friendships with other Black RAs across their departments as critical sources of support that allowed them to feel more grounded and affirmed. Participants also talked about microaggressions that they received from peers and often the silence of supervisors and how that deepened their sense of otherness on their staffs, and sometimes the weight that they felt in carrying and having to self-advocate when microaggressions did come up, and the fear of being seen as combative for speaking up. Most of the participants were women, and so that came out a lot for the women participants in particular. In terms of some implications for practice from the study, we identified creating affirming spaces. So doing what you can as an institution to build intentional support systems for Black RAs and other marginalized RAs, spaces where they can connect with others who share their identities. This could look like identity-based affinity groups, mentoring programs, informal meetups. Several of the participants talked about wanting to see more support for their mental health because of the emotional labor that often comes with the RA position. And so getting them connected to counseling center, support groups, having wellness spaces might be some examples. The addressing microaggressions, which kind of talked about, but supervisors playing more of an active role in addressing things when they come up and not expecting their student staff to handle those things alone. And then last but not least, last implication, hiring more diverse staff, because of course representation matters. And those Black RAs in the study who had Black supervisors or someone on staff that they could relate to or that shared that identity typically felt more supported and empowered. And so doing what we can to reflect on our hiring and our retention practices to try and make sure that we have a diverse professional staff that can then support a diverse student staff. And so the study really focused on kind of that real tension that Black RAs often experience in terms of building belonging while sometimes struggling to find that belonging themselves, and hoping that, we can continue to work towards creating departments and staff cultures that are inclusive and enjoy the opportunity to hear from the students and hear their stories and look at the pictures and see how they made meaning of that. And so hopefully this study and, this session continues to spark conversation and spurs people to action.
Excellent. Thank you, Morgan. So I'm going to give a beat here for anybody who wants to ask some questions to the chat box. I will add, I think it's always exciting to see photo voice, especially from our students, because it's great to be able to see what they're seeing, and especially when you put a prompt to them. And also in the age of everybody having a cell phone, it is so much easier to have photo voice studies at this point. So anyone have any questions for Morgan before we move on here? I want to give the opportunity here. So Brad was asking, did you hear any challenges from participants given the anti-DEI initiatives? And I was having the same thought, with context before Morgan answers. Of course, these were conducted and written, a year or so ago. So there are still things that anti-DEI was still going on then. We've definitely ramped up in the last 6 months or so. So I'll turn it over to Morgan to answer that question.
Yeah, there was some. One of the institutions, most of the institutions were in the Seho region that I interviewed. And so it was certainly, I think, like Brian was saying, kind of early into a lot of how anti-DEI was impacting the work that we were doing. But there were institutions, or an institution in Florida in particular, that had nixed everything related to. And so one of the RAs was drafted to do a session on microaggressions for their training and then was not able to do it. But the supervisor had them do it for their staff, which I'm probably had some potential, maybe they shouldn't have done that way, but the RA talked about how meaningful it was for their experience, but not as much related to the anti-DEI because it was kind of earlier into those conversations when this study was done.
Excellent. So thank you for that. And we will move on to our next author, which is also one of our co-editors, Paula. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. So back to the introduction, sense of belonging and the impact of the pandemic. that's the genesis of the question in my head, how has the pandemic impacted sense of belonging? It all started with a uh, pretty humble pilot program in fall 2020. And the question in my head was that, like, how has sense of belonging been changed or shifted? How has students' sense of belonging changed since the pandemic? Very clearly on, the theme that emerged from that pilot study that was conducted in fall 2020, so earlier part of the pandemic, was friendships. Friendships emerge as a primary theme. In fact, I expected to hear connection, community, something else that was more familiar in the literature. But what I heard was friendships. Students wanted to talk about friends. And at that point, 16 students were interviewed in fall 2020. Subsequently, this study was put together in fall 2022 as a follow-up to the pilot study where I invited those students to re-interview as senior students. So all of the students had a pretty normal first year experience pre-pandemic. They all lived in the residence hall with no restrictions, no pandemic. That experience was interrupted in March 2020 with the pandemic. Students were sent home, returned back for fall 2020, which is where their initial interview happened, and 4 students returned back for a follow-up interview, which is what the basis of this study is in fall 2022. So at the time of the interview, there were 4 senior students who were interviewed. All happened over Zoom for their comfort, all transcribed and qualitative studies. So the research question at hand was, what role does friendship in particular play in sense of belonging? And the second part of that question was, how has the pandemic itself impacted your sense of belonging? A couple of themes, actually several themes emerge, which was challenging. I expected a more consolidated finding, but found that several themes emerged. The first one, as was expected, was this idea of friends. Students directly tied their sense of belonging to the quality and the quantity of friends. Originally, they said, pre-pandemic, I valued my sense of belonging, or I assessed my own sense of belonging to the number of friends I had. I have 15 close friends, trusted individuals that I could go to if I needed something. And that kind of shifted more to the quality of friendship, and the level of satisfaction really varied by students. Interpersonal relationship was really tied to a smaller group of people, more quality experiences, and some students talked about groups of people, so group membership, but friends really emerged as an important theme. The second one, which again was pretty obvious, was concern over the virus. Students were fearful of contracting the virus, and it had a pretty significant negative impact on friendships. Students had to prioritize, at least temporarily in the fall, early on in the pandemic, their need to assess their need for safety and security, and yet negotiated that with their need for belonging. So here's an example. We had one student whose mom was immunocompromised, and throughout her interview, the biggest thread was, my mom is immunocompromised, and her mom actually ended up passing from complications of COVID. But she said, every time I have an interaction with somebody, even my own roommate, even my own suite mates, I think about my mom. And then I don't go home to visit my mom because she's immunocompromised. So she had a big loss, not only here on campus in terms of her interactions with other people, but also at home. So she didn't feel like she belonged on campus or at home either. Another theme that emerged was campus restrictions. Campuses, in the campus where this study took place, as in many other campuses, had all kinds of barriers to socialization. So mechanisms that students normally depended on to make friends, such as programming, social activities, um, being able to eat in the dining halls, being able to visit friends in other communities or other residence halls, all of those restrictions had a pretty big impact on friendships. And what students said was, I can't eat with my friends in the dining hall. I can't visit my friends. And a lot of students talked about, I made a lot of friends my first year. The pandemic happened, and I expected to be able to come back and live on campus and re-engage in those friendships. And that didn't happen because of the restrictions. They couldn't eat with one another. They couldn't visit at this particular campus. They couldn't visit one another in the residence halls. And so a lot of students lost those friendships that they had started their freshman year. A couple of examples of that, we had two students actually who became RAs, and the policy at the campus where the study took place was that students could not visit residence halls where they didn't live. And so when those two students became RAs, they were moved from one residence hall to another, and they couldn't visit other friends that they had made. And so they completely lost all of those friendships. One student did ask their supervisor to move them back because there was a vacancy. They moved back a semester later, but what she found, and she was actually very resentful of, was that she was not able to re-engage back with those friends, that those friends had continued their friendship and had a deeper connection, and she was not able to re-engage back where she left off. Another student in his senior year, he said, I was so lonely. And I resent, again, that word resentment. And they understood the restrictions and why they were important. And even when they were lifted, they understood that. But he said, I'm so lonely. And I know some friends who have lost their housing, have been removed from housing because they weren't paying attention to these restrictions. And so now they can't live in the residence halls. But yet I took the risk of visiting my friends, one particular friend that lived in another community, because I was so lonely that every day I had to negotiate whether to break this rule and risk being removed from housing or go see my friend. Another important theme that came up was involvement in group membership. Most of the clubs and orgs, as we know in many of our campuses, happen to be in online platforms. A simple example where I can kind of spell out the impact, we had one student and he was involved in two organizations. One was a pep band and the other one was a theater production company that happened in the residence hall. And he said, the pep band one, we were practicing online, but I eventually left them. I mean, we were practicing online. What kind of pep band is that? And the second one, he kind of stuck with it a bit more, and it was a theater production group. And he said, we practiced online, we had a performance online, but ultimately what ended up happening is a lot of that historical knowledge and that culture of theater, all of that was lost, even when we were back in person. So I felt no need to return to either of those groups. Two of the students who were interviewed actually picked clubs, club sports that were still in person. There were no contact. These were what the university called low risk club sports. And both students talked about the fact that being able to join those two club sports made them feel a really strong sense of belonging that they carried through their senior year, and that those students maintained a pretty strong friendship there. Finally, a couple of other themes that came up was interactions with peers. Students felt that interacting with one another, again, even after that pandemic, even in their senior year, they felt an awkwardness talking to one another. They felt like they didn't have a chance to practice a skill set. And most importantly, something that was very visible to me when they talked about it, I could visualize it, was, now we post-pandemic, I walk by a door and these doors typically were open, and now the halls, we've all gotten accustomed to closing our doors. So my ability to interact with someone else in between classes or walk to the bathroom in the corridor and say hi to somebody, all of that is gone. So this awkwardness and an inability to know how does one start a conversation, that came up quite a bit. Students talked about a loss of social support. Students learned to lean on one another more for emotional needs than for that fun interaction that they were accustomed to. A couple of students talked about a fear or actually overburdening those friendships, that they were relying too much on their friends for emotional and psychological support. And two students said that that reliance and burdening of those friendships actually caused negative impact on their friendships. And one student particularly said, I've lost my friends because I was leaning too much psychologically for my emotional needs. And finally, the last theme that came up was the idea of authenticity, that the friendships that students really tied to their sense of belonging were friendships where they could be authentic, where people appreciated what they could be themselves. They appreciated each other's company, where they felt supported and they had the freedom to be authentic and not feeling not judged came up a couple of times. So those were the findings of the study. Implications for practice, I think not unlike some other studies have talked about removing barriers. I think post-pandemic, all of those restrictions have been lifted. What comes next is um, this role that residential life professionals have in terms of helping students build that comfort level back in terms of interacting with one another. Students became comfortable in online platforms, and whether for ease of scheduling a meeting or just comfort, some of that has remained. Students still engaging with one another in online platforms. And they've all, our students in the study have all talked about, I'm glad we had online platforms, yet I feel like the quality of our interactions have not been the same in online platforms. So removing barriers for students to connect with one another. Like others have talked about, rethinking residential life roles. Is there somebody particular at the institution and in the organization that whose primary job is to remind the rest of the team that belonging and connection and breaking barriers is important? That could be a director of residential life. That could be someone within the organization that puts belonging in the forefront. Utilizing pre-college programs, orientations, summer programs that can help students cohort in smaller groups or before starting such a large transition into their first year or some other transition. Community spaces, I think we've talked about before. Are there ways that we could create spaces? At this particular institution, the institution decided during the pandemic to invest $1 million in a co-work field each year for several years as a way of investing in the in-person outdoors experience. And assessing our campus policies and practice. So do our housing selection process support students to live with one another, to live with friends? Are students that don't have somebody to live with, are we helping them engage and find each other? Staffing model, visit guest policies. And particularly at this institution did find that one way to achieve creating and supporting students' sense of belonging was to completely redo the RA model and kind of split it into several different roles, where one particular student role was sense of belonging and helping students make that connection. But a primary question is, how do we identify students that can't find belonging? And two, then what do we do with that? What are the actual measurable tasks that we can do to help them find belonging? Those are two questions I think we still have to grapple with.
Oh, thank you so much. Just for the sake of time, so we can get through the rest of the slides here, and I know you're handling the next slide. But after that, well, maybe I'm talking about the next slide, and we're doing the things. If you would jump into the chat and answer some of the couple of the questions that were there, give your some
Sure.
thoughts to that, and I think we could do it that way so we can stay on track for the time. But I'll
Okay.
hand
Thank
back
you
it
very
over
much.
to you for this discussion of this other article.
Thank you. The authors of this article could not join us today. Dr. Cindy Aranda Cervantes and Susana Hernandez, they talked about a custodial staff and their roles in the residence halls in terms of sense of belonging. I'll be brief here since the authors couldn't make it, but essentially they were interested in custodial staff because the custodial staff are with students day in and day out, helping them build community. They interviewed 16 students, and their research question is, what role does the custodial staff have in helping students build sense of belonging? The conceptual framework was something they wanted to study was a concept called familismo, which translates to familism. And the background behind it is familismo is a way of is a cultural belief in which one thinks about deeply rooted in the Latina community, and it's characterized by feelings of attachment, loyalty, and responsibility to the community and to others above oneself. So it's almost looking at it from a collectivistic culture that your needs are as important or more important than mine. So that's the framework they were looking at. They use pláticas, which translate to chats. It's a reciprocal model in which the researcher engages with the participants in a reciprocal way in which they share stories about cultural and values. That's the framework they looked at. So really quickly, just to make sure we're on time, findings of the study is they found that one, custodial staff were an important part in helping build community. They were oftentimes one of the first people that students engaged with. And they could share things about their cultural backgrounds, their religious background, and they really had an important part of helping them feel at home. The second finding of the study is affirming the value of the linguistic value. So all of the students spoke Spanish and English for the study. It was a part of the study, but they found that they could either feel more comfortable speaking Spanish and that there were some things that just didn't translate. And so speaking with somebody, their custodial staff, allowed them to speak more freely. They felt more comfortable, or they could practice their Spanish. That also strengthened their sense of belonging. And finally, one important piece that came out of the study was um, uh, knowledge and familial capital, that there were some values that students felt were shared with the staff, such as one that came up a lot was hardworking, putting others above others, that those shared values was something that they could share with the staff, also strengthening their feeling of belonging. Um, uh, Takeaways, the authors recommended opportunities to integrate custodians into the residential communities, to recognize um, and appreciate intentionally the value that the custodian staff has in terms of sense of belonging, and also to encourage linguistic opportunities, so hiring staff that speak Spanish so that students feel like they're at home, can practice a language that they feel more comfortable in, especially when things don't quite translate. So those are the key takeaways for the study.
And then also another author who could not join us today, Craig, in his article, really talks about a model of for residence halls and for RA model that they formulated based off of a community model, and I believe it was Baton Rouge, Louisiana, that really was focused on trying to make connections, building community within that, so that they could in Baton Rouge, and they translated it over to the university with their RAs, and really what uh, the start of it, and that was of the article, was really talking about that model and being put onto the new onto the RA staff, and how it was focused on building community, building relationships. And maybe a little bit of a departure, and I believe Brad even mentioned it before, a departure away from some of the residence life curriculums that we talked about, but this really was truly just focused on building relationships. And the article goes into talking about sort of a study on with students and how this model was working and where it was, where the findings were. And that was saying that about half of the participants really had developed a good relationship with their RA and mentioned that was part of belonging, was with their RA. But all of their the students had knew their RA and also felt like they were at least seen or recognized either in the hall. So that was a big part of it. Other staff were also mentioned as being an important part. So community directors were also seen, but in a lesser way. They did not have as deeper relationships with those community directors. But a lot of the students also talked about just the importance of the friendships that they had, that the people who lived within their room or their suite or on the hall really became an important part of where they were finding belonging on the campus. So that was a big part of the study and the findings there. I think reaffirming a lot of the things that we know about community building and whatnot. So basically, there are recommendations. Make sure that you have a program that is focused on that community and connection building, relationship building. That you have events and ways that you're bringing that forward for individuals. So I think that that's a great piece, and I hope you go off and you enjoy that as well. And I think just for timing, we're about 10 minutes left, which means we can sort of move into our final here reflections of the editor. I'll let Deb start us off real quickly, and then I'll jump back in, and Paula can add thoughts as well, and then we have some question and answer time as well.
Hi, Deb again. So, as I listen to this webinar, I'm struck again, as I was struck when we were putting this issue together, of some of the commonality of themes that came out through the articles, even though the articles really featured different perspectives. So we had the perspectives of senior housing officers, and we had the perspective of RAs, and so on. And one of them that I hear echoed in almost every article is the importance of friendship, something we just heard from this last article we heard as well. Um, and how particularly students seem to equate belonging with friendship, and then the acknowledgement of housing staff of how important friendships are. It's interesting to hear that while that is happening, simultaneously, it appears that res life professionals are equating belonging more quickly with community as opposed to individual friendships. I was interested to hear that the idea of spaces came out so much. I think we, in our field, in student affairs writ large, we tend not to pay a lot of attention to how very important spaces are and the intentionality of designing spaces um, for uses to build community, to allow students to gather, places where we can do formal and informal kinds of community building. Uh, Mental health came through in a lot of them. Um, Not surprisingly, I think, given all the talk about the mental health issues on our campuses today, and a lot of talk about staffing, and looking again at staffing. In the quote, I was talking to in the chat, I was talking to Christina, who's at the University of Dayton, who was saying that they are implementing the KCE model that we heard about in the last article on their campus. So I'm like, that'll be an interesting story to tell. Um, so those are just some of the commonalities that I'm seeing coming out of all these articles. I do want to say that working on this issue was so fun. Um, I really enjoyed hearing the perspectives of all these different folks on this important issue of belonging. I'm going to throw it to Paolo or Brian.
Yeah, I was just going to real quickly say once I also agree that working on this issue was a pleasure, particularly working with my co-editors. But one of the things I think we want to see here is, and this is something that came up when I was doing my dissertation study, when I was trying to struggle with this concept of belonging and what do we do with it. And I think, and Brad also mentioned retention is sort of the same thing, that these are outcomes, right? This is the product of what we do on campus. This isn't something that you can just say, okay, you have to have belonging now. So if we're reading all this body of literature here, but we also read the greater body of literature, it starts to give us the ingredients to bake the cake, right? So we know what we need to do on campus that results in belonging. And I think this issue really shows all those elements you can start to think of is if you are the chef in your department, what you can put into place that will outcome with belonging. And just as one of my old bosses used to say, if we chase retention, we're going to fail. We have to look at the things that outcome with retention. If we chase belonging, we're going to fail. We have to look at the things that create belonging. And to Deb's point, we conflate these ideas of community and belonging. Um, my perspective on that is community is great, belonging is deeper. But if we put everything in place that creates an atmosphere that is where belonging can thrive, uh, that's fine. If a student doesn't find belonging, they'll likely find community, or at least there'll be an environment that is good for them to be there. So those are my thoughts there, and then I'll hand it over to Paula for her final thoughts, and then questions and answers.
Yeah, sure. Really quickly, I'll say, this is my first time co-editing and it was a fun experience. Thank you for my co-editors. I encourage folks here to, don't be shy about submitting something. Don't be shy about taking these opportunities. We all have to start somewhere. So first, I'll say that. In terms of belonging, here's what I'll say. Oftentimes, and in recent, the way we've talked about belonging has been so conceptual. I want to encourage us all to, like Brian said, think about more tangible ways of defining belonging. Like if we're going to move the needle, are we going to move the needle on friendships? Are we going to move the needle on loneliness? What exactly do we want to do? And I'm biased here because I, actually wrote an article for the thing, but, one of the things that I think about is what I've in my head. I'm coining belonging friendships. What are the what are the kinds of interactions that truly help me? Is it authenticity? Is it time spent with somebody? And I really encourage us all to kind of follow that thread of thought to think about how we can move the needle. Instead of like, this is a bad metaphor, like stirring the pot. Really bad metaphors here, but you get the point.
All right, and I think that we open it up. We have just a few minutes here if you want to ask questions. Probably easier in the chat if we want to do that. But we're open to any questions about the issue, the editing process, anything that we can shed some light on.
Brian, I would just offer a comment that's it's been intriguing to me from this is, um, are we sort of seeing the end of the whole residential curriculum model, moving toward some other kind of new models? Because, most of our group said they were moving away from that, despite what the campus index said. So when I think of the KCE, I mean, I just think of it's interesting. It's an interesting transition. I don't know what that means, but just in my head, I'm thinking now, So thanks for making me think.
That's the point, I think. Camille, is there anything else that you would like to add before we are finishing up here at the hour?
Well, I would like to add a huge thank you to our guest editors and a huge thank you to our guest authors. Thank you all so much for not only all of your work up until this moment, but for sharing this hour with us today. It really offers our association members just that further engagement with the journal, and to Tony's point, keeps us all thinking. So thank you for a wonderful presentation today, and thank you to all the attendees. Please keep on reading the journal.